Before I left for China, I thought I already knew what I was going to find. Like millions of people around the world, my understanding of the country had been shaped by years of headlines, economic reports, documentaries, political debates, and expert opinions. Everywhere I looked there seemed to be a strong narrative about what China was becoming and where it was heading. Some people believed China's best days were behind it. Others believed it would eventually become the dominant economic force of the 21st century. But after spending 10 days traveling through China, speaking with business owners, investors, engineers, entrepreneurs, and ordinary people, I came home with a very different conclusion. The most important lesson I learned wasn't about China itself. It was about how easy it is to misunderstand the future when we rely entirely on second-hand information. What I saw during those 10 days challenged some of my assumptions, confirmed others, and forced me to ask a question that every investor, business owner, and professional should be asking right now. Are we paying attention to where the world is going, or are we still making decisions based on where the world used to be? That question stayed in my mind throughout the entire trip, and by the time I returned home, I realized that the answer may shape some of the biggest opportunities and risks of the next decade. 10 days may not sound like enough time to understand a country as large and complex as China. In many ways, it isn't. No country with more than 1 billion people can be fully understood in such a short period of time. But sometimes a brief experience can reveal something important. It can expose the difference between perception and reality. It can challenge assumptions that have gone unquestioned for years. And it can provide insights that statistics alone cannot capture. Before arriving in China, I expected to find an economy facing serious challenges. The headlines had prepared me for stories about slowing growth, demographic concerns, real estate problems, rising debt levels, and geopolitical tensions. Those challenges are real, and anyone discussing China's future honestly must acknowledge them. But what surprised me was that those challenges represented only part of the picture. The reality I observed on the ground was far more complicated and far more interesting than the simplified narratives that often dominate public discussion. One of the first things that caught my attention was the scale of long-term planning. Everywhere I traveled, I saw evidence of investments designed not for next year or even the next 5 years, but for decades into the future. Massive transportation networks connected cities with remarkable efficiency. New infrastructure projects were visible in multiple regions. Advanced manufacturing facilities were expanding production capabilities. Technology parks were filled with companies developing products and services aimed at future industries rather than current trends. Whether every one of these investments succeeds is impossible to know. History teaches us that not every ambitious project delivers the expected results. However, what impressed me was the willingness to think beyond immediate outcomes. In a world increasingly obsessed with quarterly earnings, reports, and short-term performance metrics, I encountered many people who appeared focused on the next 10 or 20 years rather than the next 10 or 20 weeks. Another observation involved technology. Much of the world still views innovation primarily through an American lens. There are good reasons for that. The United States remains home to some of the most influential technology companies in history. Yet what I saw in China reminded me that innovation is no longer concentrated in one location. Chinese companies are competing aggressively in fields such as artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, robotics, renewable energy, battery technology, advanced manufacturing, and digital commerce. In several industries, the competition is not merely about catching up. It is about pushing boundaries and redefining expectations. What surprised me was not simply the level of technological development. It was the speed at which new ideas appeared to move from concept to implementation. The pace of execution was something I encountered repeatedly throughout the trip. One area where this was particularly visible was transportation. In many parts of the world, discussions about future transportation systems remain largely theoretical. In China, many of those systems are already operating at scale. High-speed rail networks connect major population centers with extraordinary efficiency. Electric vehicles have become a normal part of everyday life, rather than a niche product for early adopters. Digital payment systems are integrated so deeply into daily transactions that carrying physical cash often feels unnecessary. None of these developments alone define a country's future, but together they create an environment that feels intensely focused on modernization and efficiency. Perhaps the most surprising lesson came from conversations with entrepreneurs. I expected confidence, but I did not expect the level of competitiveness that I encountered. Many entrepreneurs describe business environments where companies must innovate constantly simply to survive. Competition is fierce. Margins can be thin. Consumer expectations are high. While this environment creates pressure, it also encourages rapid improvement. Businesses that fail to adapt quickly fall behind. Businesses that innovate effectively gain advantages. The result is an ecosystem that continuously pushes participants to improve products, reduce costs, and explore new opportunities. I also spent considerable time speaking with investors. These conversations were especially interesting because investors spend their lives trying to identify opportunities before they become obvious. What stood out was not blind optimism. In fact, many investors openly discussed concerns about debt, demographics, regulation, and geopolitical risks. They understood that China's future is not guaranteed. Yet despite acknowledging these risks, many believed that international perceptions had become too one-sided. They argued that while the world was focused heavily on challenges, it was paying insufficient attention to areas where progress was occurring rapidly. Whether their assessment ultimately proves correct remains uncertain, but it reminded me of an important investing principle. The best opportunities often emerge when perception and reality diverge significantly. As the trip continued, I found myself thinking less about individual companies and more about larger trends. The global economy is undergoing a period of transformation. Technology is reshaping industries. Supply chains are evolving. Energy systems are changing. Artificial intelligence is creating entirely new possibilities. Demographic shifts are influencing labor markets. Capital is moving across borders in search of growth and opportunity. These changes are not limited to one country. They are global in nature. However, what I observed in China suggested that many people there are preparing aggressively for this new era rather than simply reacting to it. Another lesson involved the importance of keeping an open mind. One of the biggest mistakes people make is becoming emotionally attached to a particular narrative. Once we adopt a belief, we naturally seek information that confirms it while ignoring information that challenges it. Investors do this. Governments do this. Businesses do this. Individuals do this. My experience in China reminded me that reality, usually more complex than any single narrative can capture. A country can face serious challenges while simultaneously creating impressive opportunities. An economy can experience short-term difficulties while still investing heavily in long-term growth. These realities are not mutually exclusive. When my 10 days finally came to an end, I did not leave believing that China has solved every problem or discovered a secret formula for success. No country has. Every economy faces obstacles. Every government makes mistakes. Every market experiences periods of uncertainty. But I did leave with a deeper appreciation for the scale of what is happening there and for the importance of observing developments firsthand whenever possible. Most importantly, I left convinced that the future will not be shaped by a single country, a single company, or a single idea. It will be shaped by competition, innovation, adaptation, and the willingness to prepare for a world that looks different from the one we know today. The biggest lesson I learned during those 10 days was surprisingly simple. Never underestimate how quickly the world can change. The future rarely arrives with a loud announcement. It emerges gradually through thousands of decisions made by entrepreneurs, engineers, investors, workers, and consumers. By the time a trend becomes obvious to everyone, the most significant opportunities are often already behind us. That is why curiosity matters. That is why adaptability matters. And that is why challenging our assumptions matters. China reminded me of all three lessons every single day, regardless of your views about the country, your investments, or the future of the global economy. Those lessons may prove more valuable than any prediction anyone can make about what happens next.